Willa Brooks lived alone in the Colorado mountains for a reason. 3 years ago, a rodeo accident left her partially paralyzed and ended her championship barrel racing career. Now she splits firewood, tends 3 horses, and avoids people who knew her before. The isolation suits her fine until a massive blizzard hits and she collapses in the snow while gathering firewood. Enter Harlan Creed, a wealthy cattleman driving his snowcat through the storm. He spots her unconscious body and faces a choice: keep driving and mind his own business, or stop and help a stranger who might not survive the night. He stops. What begins as a simple rescue becomes a 20-mile journey through whiteout conditions to the nearest help. But would carrying someone through a blizzard be enough to heal the deeper wounds that had frozen their hearts long before winter arrived? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The cabin sat like a forgotten prayer in the valley, tucked between 2 ridges that had sheltered it from Colorado's worst tantrums for nearly a century. Willa Brooks had found it through a classified ad that read more like a warning than an offer: remote property, no utilities, no neighbors, cash only. Perfect, she'd thought at the time, exactly what someone goes looking for when they want the world to forget they exist. 3 years later, she'd carved out something resembling a life from the raw materials of solitude and stubbornness. Her days began before dawn, with the ritual of splitting kindling, her movements efficient, despite the way her left leg dragged slightly with each step. The doctors had called it a miracle that she'd kept the leg at all after the accident. She'd stopped calling it miraculous when she realized miracles were supposed to feel like blessings, not daily reminders of everything you'd lost. The accident itself had become a story told in whispers throughout the rodeo circuit. Willa Brooks, 3-time national barrel racing champion, taken down by a spooked horse in what should have been a routine practice run. The horse, Thunder Bay, a mare she'd trained from a filly, had never spooked before, never even flinched at loud noises or sudden movements. But something had gone wrong that day, something the veterinarians and trainers and insurance investigators never could explain. One moment Willa was leaning into a turn that would have shaved 0.2 of a second off her personal best. And the next, she was waking up in a hospital bed with a surgeon explaining the intricate geography of her shattered spine. "You'll walk again," he'd said with the kind of certainty that doctors use when they're trying to convince themselves as much as their patients. "It'll take time and you'll need to adjust your expectations, but you'll walk." He'd been right about the walking, wrong about everything else. The rodeo world had tried to be kind in its clumsy way. Benefit rides, fundraising barbecues, a scholarship fund established in her name. All of it well-intentioned and absolutely unbearable. She'd endured 6 months of it, the careful conversations, the way people's eyes would dart to her cane and then quickly away. The gradual realization that she'd become a symbol of tragedy rather than triumph. The final straw had come at a retirement party for one of the older riders, when she'd overheard 2 young competitors talking near the punch bowl. "Such a shame about Willa," one had said. "She was really something before the accident." Before. As if everything that came after was just epilogue. She'd left that night, loading her truck with the bare essentials and driving until the roads turned to gravel, then dirt, then finally the 2-track path that led to the cabin. The previous owner had been a prospector named Eugene Hartwell, a man who'd spent 40 years chasing silver veins that existed mostly in his imagination. He'd died the previous winter, peacefully in his sleep, according to the lawyer who'd handled the estate. Willa sometimes wondered if he'd found what he was looking for in those final moments, or if he'd simply made peace with the searching itself. The cabin bore the marks of Eugene's practical eccentricities. Solar panels, cobbled together from salvaged components, provided enough electricity for basic needs. A wood-burning stove dominated the main room, its chimney drawing clean thanks to Eugene's careful stonework. The water came from a well he'd dug by hand, pumped through a system that worked as long as you understood its temperamental rhythms. It was a life reduced to its essential elements: warmth, shelter, sustenance, and the daily satisfaction of problems solved through effort rather than money. Willa had adapted to these rhythms with the same determination that had once driven her to perfect her barrel times. She'd learned to split wood with an axe, heavy enough to make up for her compromised stance. She'd mastered the art of preserving food without a proper freezer, turning the root cellar into a natural refrigeration system. She'd even taught herself basic carpentry, patching the cabin's inevitable weak spots with materials salvaged from Eugene's extensive collection of might-be-useful-someday items. But it was the horses that had surprised her most. She'd never intended to keep them. The 3 aging ranch horses that came with the property had seemed like more responsibility than she was ready for. Thunder, a 20-year-old gelding with arthritic knees, Sage, a paint mare whose best years were behind her, and Dusty, a sorrel whose main qualification seemed to be an unflappable temperament. Eugene had kept them more for companionship than utility, according to his journals, and Willa had initially planned to find them new homes. Instead, she'd found herself drawn to their quiet presence. Unlike the people she'd left behind, the horses didn't treat her differently now. They didn't notice her limp or flinch when she needed to use Eugene's hand-carved walking stick to navigate uneven ground. They simply expected the same things they'd always expected: feed, water, and the occasional scratch behind the ears. It was the first relationship she'd maintained since the accident that didn't feel weighted down by before and after. The walking stick had become her most treasured inheritance from Eugene. Carved from a single piece of mountain ash, it bore the smooth patina of decades of use. Eugene had whittled small notches along its length, one for each year he'd spent in the mountains, according to a note she'd found tucked inside his desk. 43 notches in total, representing a lifetime of stubborn independence that Willa understood in her bones. The morning of the storm, Willa followed her usual routine with the satisfaction of someone who'd found her rhythm. Coffee first, black and strong enough to strip paint, brewed on the wood stove in a battered enamel pot. Then out to check on the horses, her breath visible in the crisp air as she made her way to the small barn that sheltered them from the worst weather. Thunder nickered as she approached, a sound that had become as much a part of her morning as the coffee ritual. "Morning, old man," she said, running her hand along his neck. His winter coat had grown thick and shaggy, making him look more like a woolly mammoth than a horse. "Storm coming, isn't it?" The horses seemed to sense it too. Sage kept looking toward the north, her ears pricked forward as if listening to something beyond human hearing. Dusty stood closer to the barn than usual, his normally placid expression touched with an alertness that spoke of ancestral memories of prairie blizzards and the wolves that followed them. Willa had learned to read the weather through signs like these, the subtle indicators that preceded the official forecasts by hours or sometimes days. The way the light took on a particular quality, flat and grey despite the absence of clouds. The stillness that fell over the valley, as if the land itself was holding its breath. The behavior of the wildlife, how the rabbits disappeared completely and the birds gathered in restless flocks before vanishing into whatever sheltered places they'd claimed for winter. She'd checked the weather radio the night before, a habit left over from her cautious early days at the cabin. The small device sat on her kitchen counter, its antenna extended toward the window, in perpetual hope of catching signals from the world beyond the mountains. The forecast had mentioned the possibility of snow, but the terminology had been vague, words like potential and scattered that could mean anything from a light dusting to conditions that would strand her for a week. She'd learned not to trust the optimism of meteorologists who broadcast from heated studios in Denver, 50 miles and several weather systems away from her particular corner of the mountains. Instead, she trusted the ache in her reconstructed spine, which had developed an uncanny ability to predict atmospheric pressure changes. This morning, that ache had woken her 2 hours before dawn, a deep throb that spoke of something significant, building in the northern sky. She'd lain in bed, listening to the absolute silence outside, the kind of quiet that only came when the world was preparing for violence. By the time she'd finished with the horses and returned to the cabin, the first clouds had appeared on the horizon. They looked innocent enough from a distance, white and puffy like the illustrations in children's books, but Willa had spent enough winters in the mountains to recognize the deception. Those innocent clouds were scouts, the advance guard of something, much larger gathering beyond the peaks. She spent the morning preparing in the methodical way that had become second nature. Extra wood brought in and stacked near the stove. Water containers filled and placed where they wouldn't freeze. Battery-powered radio checked and rechecked. Kerosene lamps cleaned and positioned throughout the cabin. It was a routine born of experience and the kind of respect for winter that came from living close enough to feel its teeth. The horses would be fine in the barn, which Eugene had built with the same over-engineered thoroughness he'd applied to everything else. The structure was solid enough to withstand whatever wind the storm might bring, and she'd already filled their water troughs and distributed enough hay to last several days. They'd weathered worse storms in that barn, probably more comfortable than she'd be in the cabin once the real cold arrived. By noon, the first snowflakes were falling. Large, lazy flakes that drifted down without urgency, the kind that made children press their faces to windows and adults start thinking about hot chocolate. But Willa knew better. These gentle flakes were just the beginning, the soft opening notes of what would become a much more demanding symphony. The weather radio crackled to life with an updated forecast that made her stomach tighten. Blizzard warnings now, with accumulations that stretched the imagination and wind speeds that turned snow into weapons. Travel not recommended had become travel not possible, and the estimated duration kept stretching like a bad dream that refused to end. She was reaching for another log to add to her indoor pile when she noticed something that made her heart skip. The firewood supply that had looked adequate yesterday now seemed woefully insufficient for what the radio was describing. The cold. Snap 2 weeks earlier had forced her to burn more than usual, and she'd been putting off the trip to her main woodpile, located in a clearing about a quarter-mile from the cabin. Eugene's walking stick leaned against the wall beside the door, its worn surface seeming to whisper encouragement. 43 winters of mountain survival, 43 notches of stubborn endurance. If Eugene could last 4 decades in this country, she could manage 1 trip to the woodpile. The doubt crept in anyway, familiar as an old enemy. The voice that questioned every decision, every assumption about her own capabilities. The voice that asked, with increasing insistence, whether she was really as prepared for this life as she'd convinced herself to believe. It was the same voice that had driven her from the rodeo circuit, the one that insisted she was broken beyond repair, a burden disguised as independence. But as she stood at her window, watching the snow begin to fall with increasing purpose, Willa felt something else rising to meet the doubt. 3 years of splitting her own wood, hauling her own water, solving her own problems. 3 years of proving that broken didn't mean helpless, that different didn't mean less. She'd earned her place in these mountains through sweat and stubbornness, and the daily choice to keep going when everything would have been easier if she'd just given up. The woodpile wasn't far. She knew the path by heart, had walked it dozens of times in all kinds of weather. Eugene's blazes marked the route clearly, and she had emergency supplies, warm clothes, and enough experience to handle whatever the mountains might throw at her. The snow was still manageable, more atmospheric than dangerous. What she didn't know as she pulled on her heaviest coat and checked the battery life on her emergency radio was that 17 miles away, a man named Harlan Creed was making his own calculations about the approaching storm, a man whose wealth had insulated him from most of life's inconveniences, but who'd chosen to take the back roads home from a cattle auction, because sometimes the longest route felt like the only honest one. A man who carried his own collection of scars, invisible but no less crippling than the damage that marked Willa's spine, who'd learned that money could buy almost anything except the ability to undo the moments that defined everything that came after. The storm was coming, patient and implacable as winter itself. And in the vast emptiness of the Colorado Rockies, two people who'd spent years avoiding the complications of human connection were about to discover that survival sometimes required exactly the kind of trust they'd both sworn off forever. The snow had been falling for 3 hours when Willa finally acknowledged what her body had been trying to tell her all morning. The ache in her spine had deepened from a familiar throb to something that made her catch her breath with each movement. Her left leg, always unreliable in cold weather, had begun the cramping that preceded total rebellion, and the temperature was dropping faster than the forecasters had predicted, transforming those lazy afternoon flakes into something with teeth. She stood at her cabin window, watching the world disappear behind a curtain of white, and felt the familiar weight of a decision she didn't want to make. The firewood situation had gone from inconvenient to potentially dangerous. Her indoor supply might last through the night if she was careful, but the storm showed no signs of the brief tantrum the radio had promised. The latest weather update, crackling through static, mentioned words that made her stomach tighten. Unprecedented accumulation and extended duration and travel not recommended. But recommended by whom? People who had backup heating systems and neighbors within shouting distance. People who'd never spent a Colorado winter alone, measuring their survival in cords of wood and degrees of body heat. Willa pulled on her insulated boots with movements made clumsy by the cold that had already seeped through the cabin's walls. The wood stove was efficient, but it couldn't work miracles, and miracles were starting to look like what she'd need to make it through the next few days without more fuel. Eugene's walking stick felt solid in her grip as she prepared for the journey, its familiar weight a comfort against the growing uncertainty. The emergency whistle hung around her neck on a braided cord, a piece of equipment she'd never needed, but carried religiously. 3 sharp blasts for help, the universal signal that someone needed rescue. But rescue from whom? In country where the nearest neighbor lived 15 miles away and the nearest road crew might not pass for weeks. The walk to the woodpile usually took 15 minutes on the winding path that followed the old logging road. In good weather, it was almost pleasant, a chance to check the forest for signs of wildlife, to note the changing seasons in the behavior of the trees. She'd made the trip dozens of times since moving to the cabin, hauling wood back in the small cart Eugene had built for the purpose. Her legs had grown stronger over the months, adapting to the uneven terrain and the constant small challenges of mountain living. But this wouldn't be a usual trip. The snow was already ankle-deep and falling faster, transforming familiar landmarks into ghostly approximations. The temperature had dropped below freezing, and the wind was beginning to find its voice, moaning through the pine branches with a sound that spoke of worse things coming. Willa strapped on the snowshoes Eugene had left hanging in the mudroom, grateful for his practical foresight. The bindings were worn but functional, designed for someone who understood that in country like this, the difference between prepared and dead was often measured in inches of snow. She checked her emergency supplies one final time: water bottle, energy bars, matches in a waterproof container, and the whistle that now felt more like a talisman than a tool. The cold hit her like a physical blow as she stepped outside, driving. Through her coat and settling into her bones with familiar cruelty. Her left leg immediately began the stiff, dragging protest that cold weather always triggered, the damaged nerves sending confused signals that made each step an exercise in negotiation. But she'd learned to work with these limitations, to find the rhythm that allowed forward progress despite the body's rebellion. The path to the woodpile was marked by a series of blazes Eugene had cut into trees along the route, orange paint that stood out even in poor visibility, Willa had memorized their sequence over the months, turning the navigation into a connect-the-dots game that kept her mind occupied during routine trips. But today, the familiar blazes appeared and disappeared in the swirling snow like intermittent lighthouses, visible for moments before vanishing behind the white curtain. She made steady progress for the first 10 minutes, her breathing settling into the rhythm of snowshoe travel. The path wound through a grove of aspen that provided some shelter from the wind, their bare branches creating a network of shadows against the grey sky. Eugene's stick proved invaluable here, helping her maintain balance on the uneven terrain as the snow began to drift across the trail. But as she climbed toward the clearing where the woodpile waited, the wind found its full voice. What had been a gentle snowfall transformed into something angrier, the flakes driving horizontally now, stinging any exposed skin and making it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead. The blazes became harder to spot, forcing her to move more slowly, checking each tree carefully before proceeding to the next landmark. 17 miles away, Harlan Creed sat behind the wheel of his modified snowcat, watching the same storm transform the back roads into something that challenged even his vehicle's capabilities. He'd left the cattle auction in Steamboat Springs 3 hours earlier, choosing the scenic route home because the main highways felt too much like surrender. At 62, Harlan had accumulated enough wealth to insulate himself from most inconveniences, but he'd never lost his preference for the harder path when easier options felt like admissions of weakness. The snowcat was a concession to practicality rather than luxury, though it had cost more than most people's houses. Custom-built for mountain conditions, it could handle snow depths that would stop conventional vehicles and maintain traction on grades that would challenge a mountain goat. Harlan had bought it after the 3rd time he'd been stranded by unexpected weather, tired of depending on others for rescue. He'd built his fortune in cattle and land, starting with a small ranch inherited from his grandfather and growing it through careful acquisitions and harder work than anyone expected from a man who could afford to hire others. But work had always been his refuge from thoughts he preferred not to think, and success had become a habit that consumed everything else worth having. The storm was making him reconsider his route choice. Visibility had dropped to almost nothing, and even the snowcat's advanced navigation system was struggling with the whiteout conditions. He could turn back, find a hotel in Steamboat Springs, wait for the storm to pass like any sensible person would do. But sensible had never been his strong suit, and the empty house, waiting at the end of the journey, felt like too much honesty to face in a warm hotel room. Willa reached the woodpile just as her left leg began to seriously fail her. The clearing sat on a small rise that normally provided a good view of the surrounding forest, but today it felt like standing inside a snow globe being shaken by an angry child. The woodpile itself was exactly where she'd left it, protected by Eugene's careful tarping and elevated on pallets that kept it clear of ground moisture. Loading the cart should have been routine work, but her body had other ideas. The cold had settled deep into her reconstructed spine, making every movement an exercise in controlled pain. Her left leg cramped with increasing frequency, the muscles seizing without warning and forcing her to pause until the spasm passed. What should have taken 10 minutes stretched to 20, then 30, as she fought her own limitations while the storm grew more aggressive around her. She managed to load about half her usual haul before admitting defeat. Better to make the return trip with something than risk being stranded with nothing. The cart felt heavier than usual as she began the journey back, the added weight making her snowshoes less stable on the increasingly treacherous path. The wind had erased some of Eugene's blazes under fresh snow, forcing her to navigate by memory and instinct. What had been a clear trail an hour earlier now required careful interpretation, reading the subtle signs that marked the safe route through terrain that could turn deadly if she chose wrong. Harlan was considering his options when he saw something that made him slow the snowcat to a crawl. Through the driving snow, barely visible against the white landscape, something dark moved near the tree line. His first thought was wildlife, elk or deer seeking shelter from the storm, but as he drew closer, the shape resolved into something that made his chest tighten with recognition. A person. Someone struggling through snow that was now knee-deep, moving with the unsteady gait of someone fighting their own body as much as the weather. Harlan's instinct was to keep driving, to mind his own business the way he'd learned to do over years of disappointed expectations. But something about the figure's determination, the stubborn refusal to quit, even as they stumbled and fought for every step, reminded him of someone he'd tried very hard to forget. Willa felt the moment when her body finally said no. One step. Her left leg was supporting her weight, and the next it simply wasn't. She went down hard, the cart overturning and spilling wood across the path. The snow felt warm against her face for a moment before the cold began to seep through her clothes, and she realized with crystalline clarity that she was in serious trouble. The emergency whistle was around her neck, but who would hear it? The nearest house was 15 miles away, and the storm would muffle any sound long before it traveled that far. She tried to push herself upright, but her leg wouldn't cooperate, cramping so severely that she cried out despite herself. Through the swirling snow, she heard the sound of an engine, low and powerful and getting closer. Help, or at least the possibility of help, approaching through the storm. But Willa Brooks had spent 3 years learning that help always came with a price, and she wasn't sure she was ready to pay whatever this would cost. The snowcat's headlights cut through the white curtain, illuminating a scene that would haunt Harlan Creed for the rest of his life. A woman down in the snow, surrounded by scattered firewood, clearly in distress, but still trying to gather herself up rather than wave for assistance. Pride and necessity locked in battle while the storm raged around them both. Two strangers about to discover what it meant to depend on someone you'd never expected to meet. Harlan sat in the cab of his snowcat for what felt like an eternity, but was probably less than 30 seconds, watching the woman struggle to right herself in the deepening snow. Every instinct he'd developed over 6 decades told him to keep driving. Mind your own business. Don't get involved. People who ended up stranded in storms like this usually got there through their own poor decisions, and rescuing them only encouraged more of the same reckless behavior. But something about her refusal to signal for help, the way she kept trying to gather the scattered firewood, even as her body clearly rebelled against the effort, reminded him uncomfortably of someone else who'd been too proud to ask for what she needed. Someone who'd paid the ultimate price for that kind of stubborn independence. The memory made his decision for him. Harlan pulled off his expensive leather gloves, Italian leather, custom-fitted, worth more than most people spent, on winter gear, and stepped out into the storm. The cold hit him like a physical assault, but he'd spent enough years working cattle in mountain weather to function despite the discomfort. He approached slowly, the way he'd learned to approach injured animals, ready to back off if his presence caused more harm than help. "Ma'am." His voice was deeper than he'd intended, roughened by years of shouting over wind and machinery. "You hurt?" Willa's head snapped up at the sound, and Harlan found himself looking into eyes the color of storm clouds, sharp with intelligence, and bright with the kind of anger that usually masked fear. She was younger than he'd expected, maybe 40, with premature lines around her eyes that spoke of pain carefully managed. Her dark hair had escaped from beneath her knit cap, and snow clung to her face like powder on a stage actress. "I'm fine," she said, which was obviously a lie, given that she was sitting in snow up to her waist, with firewood scattered around her like the aftermath of an explosion. Just taking a breather. Harlan had heard that particular tone before. The voice of someone who'd rather freeze to death than admit weakness. He'd used it himself often enough to recognize it in others. "Road's blocked about a mile back," he said conversationally, as if they were discussing the weather over coffee instead of conducting a potential rescue in the middle of a blizzard. "Tree down across the path. Won't be any traffic through here. For days, maybe weeks. The information hit Willa like a slap. Her cabin sat at the end of that road, accessible only by the route Harlan had just described as impassable. Even if she could make it back with her injured leg, she'd be completely cut off until the storm passed and crews could clear the way. "Radio's not picking up anything either," Harlan continued, pulling off his second glove to check his handheld device. The expensive leather lay dark against the white snow, already accumulating flakes that would ruin the fine finish. Storms interfering with most communications. Willa tried again to stand, using Eugene's walking stick for leverage, but her left leg buckled the moment she put weight on it. The spasm that shot through her spine was sharp enough to make her gasp, though she tried to disguise it as breathlessness from the cold. Harlan noticed anyway. He'd spent enough time around injured animals to recognize the signs of someone fighting their own body. Without asking permission, he knelt beside her in the snow, his movements careful and deliberate. "Let me take a look at that leg." "I said I'm fine." But the words lacked conviction now, colored by the growing realization that fine might not be enough to get her home alive. "Lady, I've been working cattle for 40 years. I know the difference between fine and hurt, too proud to admit it." His voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed, but there was gentleness underneath it too. "You can sit here and argue with me while we both freeze, or you can let me help figure out what's wrong." The practical part of Willa's mind, the part that had kept her alive for 3 years in the mountains, recognized the logic. But accepting help meant acknowledging that her carefully constructed independence had limits, that the life she'd built around self-sufficiency had cracks that could be exploited by weather and circumstance and her own physical limitations. "My leg cramps up in the cold," she finally admitted. "Old injury, usually works itself out, but this is worse than usual." Harlan nodded as if she'd just confirmed something he'd already suspected. His hands moved with surprising gentleness as he examined her left leg through her heavy pants, checking for obvious signs of serious injury. His touch was professional, impersonal, the kind of careful assessment she remembered from physical therapists and doctors. "Circulation's good," he said after a moment. "Muscle spasm, probably made worse by the cold and exertion." "You been walking on this long?" "About an hour. Maybe more." Time had become fluid during her struggle with the storm, minutes stretching like taffy while she fought for each step forward. In this weather, with that kind of injury? Harlan sat back on his heels, studying her face. "That's either very brave or very stupid. Haven't decided which yet." Despite everything, Willa felt the corner of her mouth twitch toward a smile. "Most people would say stupid. Most people haven't spent much time alone in country like this." He stood, brushing snow from his knees. "Question now is what we do about it. My vehicle can handle the snow, but not with that tree blocking the road. Nearest help is 20 miles through terrain that's getting worse by the minute." The reality of their situation settled around them like the falling snow. Willa was injured and possibly hypothermic. Harlan had transportation, but nowhere to go. The storm showed no signs of letting up, and the temperature was dropping as afternoon faded toward evening. "I've got emergency supplies," Harlan said, gesturing toward the snowcat. "Food, water, first aid kit, sleeping bags rated for cold weather. Vehicles got heat and can idle all night if necessary." "You're suggesting we wait it out?" "I'm suggesting we don't have many other choices." He looked at the scattered firewood, then at Willa's pale face. "Unless you've got a better idea." Willa wanted to argue, to insist that she could manage on. Her own, the way she'd managed everything else for the past 3 years. But the cold was seeping through her clothes now, and her legs showed no signs of cooperating with her pride. The practical part of her mind was already calculating odds, and none of them favored a solo attempt to reach safety. "I don't even know." "Your name," she said, which wasn't really an objection but felt like something that should be addressed before she trusted her life to a stranger. "Harlan Creed." He held out his hand, formal despite the circumstances. "And you are?" "Willa Brooks." His grip was firm and warm, calloused from work despite the expensive gloves. I suppose if we're going to be storm partners, we should probably get acquainted. Probably should, Harlan agreed. Though I should warn you, I'm not much for conversation. Good, Willa said, accepting his help to stand. Neither am I. But as Harlan helped her toward the warmth and shelter of his snowcat, both of them suspected that the storm might have other plans for their carefully maintained silence. The interior of Harlan's snowcat was like stepping into a different world. Willa had expected utilitarian transport, something functional but Spartan. Instead, she found herself in what amounted to a mobile command center, complete with GPS navigation, satellite radio, and heated seats that made her frozen muscles begin to unclench for the first time in hours. "This is not your average ranch vehicle," she observed, settling into the passenger seat with a grateful sigh. Harlan's expression remained neutral as he climbed behind the wheel. "I don't believe in being unprepared." He adjusted the heat controls, directing warm air toward her feet. Hypothermia's nothing to mess around with in country like this. The warmth felt like a benediction, but Willa couldn't quite relax into it. Accepting help was one thing. Accepting this level of luxury felt like admitting she was completely out of her depth. How much does something like this cost? More than it's worth, probably. Harlan was checking his instruments, calibrating GPS coordinates with the methodical attention of someone who understood that details mattered when lives were at stake. "But less than a funeral, so I figure it evens out." The comment held an edge that made Willa study his profile more carefully. Harlan Creed was handsome in the weathered way of men who'd spent their lives outdoors, with silver threading through dark hair and lines around his eyes that could have been from squinting at horizons or something more painful. His clothes were expensive but practical, the kind of gear that cost a fortune but earned its price through performance rather than fashion. "You make a habit of rescuing stranded travelers?" she asked. "No." The answer was flat, final, the kind of response that ended conversations rather than encouraging them. But Willa had spent 3 years learning to read silences, and this one felt loaded with history. "Then why stop for me?" Harlan's hands tightened on the steering wheel. For a moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, "Let's just say I know what it looks like when someone's too stubborn to ask for help." Outside, the storm was intensifying. Even through the snowcat's heated cab, they could hear the wind building to a howl that spoke of conditions becoming truly dangerous. Harlan studied his navigation display, comparing their position to the terrain maps loaded in the system. "Nearest shelter's about 15 miles northeast," he said finally. "Old ranger station, probably unmanned this time of year, but should have basic facilities." "What about my cabin?" "What about it? It's less than 2 miles from here. I've got supplies, heat, everything we need to wait out the storm." Harlan shook his head. "Road's blocked, remember? Tree down. Even if we could get around it on foot." "You're in no condition for that kind of hike in these conditions." Willa wanted to argue, but the pain in her leg was getting worse instead of better, and she could feel the exhaustion of fighting both the weather and her own body beginning to catch up with her. Still, the idea of abandoning her carefully constructed sanctuary felt like surrender. "Those horses of mine will need tending," she said. "They're in the barn. But if this storm lasts as long as the radio's predicting, horses are tougher than people give them credit for," Harlan replied. "They'll hunker down and wait it out. Question is whether we can do the same." He was right, and they both knew it. The storm was beyond anything either of them could handle alone, and the temperature was dropping fast enough to make their current location untenable within hours. But agreeing to leave meant trusting this stranger with her life. And trust wasn't something Willa had much practice with anymore. "Tell me about this ranger station," she said finally. "Basic shelter, wood stove, probably some emergency supplies left over from summer cruise." Harlan was already plotting a route on his GPS, calculating distances and obstacles. "Problem is getting there. This vehicle can handle the snow, but not with a passenger who can't walk. If we get stuck, The practical assessment stung, but Willa had to admit its accuracy. Her leg was useless for any kind of serious hiking, and the cold had sapped more of her strength than she wanted to acknowledge. She was rapidly becoming a liability rather than a partner in their survival. "What do you suggest?" Harlan was quiet for a long moment, studying the terrain maps and weather data scrolling across his dashboard displays. When he spoke, his voice carried the tone of someone who'd made difficult decisions before and understood their weight. "I've got rope, a tarp, some aluminum tubing in the gear compartment. We could rig up a sled of sorts, pull you behind the vehicle on the easier stretches." The image of being dragged through a blizzard like cargo made Willa's cheeks burn with embarrassment. "That's your solution? Turn me into freight? My solution is to get us both somewhere warm and safe before this storm kills us." Harlan's voice was patient but firm. "Your pride's not worth both our lives." The bluntness of it was like cold water, washing away her objections with its simple honesty. He was right, of course. In her rodeo days, she'd seen plenty of competitors whose egos had written checks their bodies couldn't cash. The smart ones learned to recognize when pride became dangerous. The others didn't compete for very long. "How would it work?" she asked. "Simple engineering. Tarp stretched between aluminum poles, rope harness to attach it to the vehicle. You'd be wrapped up warm, protected from the wind. Not comfortable, but better than freezing." Willa tried to imagine herself bundled up and towed through a blizzard by a man she'd met an hour ago. Everything in her rebelled against the helplessness of it, the complete dependence on someone else's competence and goodwill. But the alternative was accepting that her stubborn independence might be the last decision she ever made. "All right," she said quietly. "Let's build your sled." The construction took nearly an hour, both of them working in the lee of the snowcat, while the storm raged around them. Harlan's hands moved with the confidence of someone who'd spent his life solving practical problems, assembling the makeshift sled with materials that had probably never been intended for rescue operations. Willa helped where she could, holding pieces in place while he secured connections with rope and bungee cords. The work was cold and awkward, but it felt good to be contributing something instead of just accepting rescue passively. "You're handy with tools," Harlan observed, as she anticipated his need for a particular length of rope. "Had to learn. Living alone like I do. You either figure out how to fix things yourself or you go without." "How long you been up there alone?" 3 years. She didn't elaborate, and he didn't push. When the sled was finished, it looked like exactly what it was, an improvised solution born of necessity and limited resources. But it was solidly built, and the tarp provided a cocoon that would protect her from the worst of the wind and cold. "Ready?" Harlan asked. Willa looked at the makeshift contraption that would either save her life or provide an interesting story for whoever found their bodies come spring. As ready as anyone can be for something this crazy. But as she settled into the sled and felt Harlan secure the safety lines that would keep her attached to the vehicle, she realized that somewhere in the process of building their solution, her resentment at needing help had transformed into something closer to gratitude. Not for the rescue itself, but for the way he'd included her in planning it, treated her as a partner in their survival, rather than just a problem to be solved. The storm was still dangerous, their destination uncertain, and their improvised equipment untested. But for the first time since the accident that had changed everything, Willa Brooks found herself depending on someone else's strength without feeling diminished by the need. The abandoned hunting cabin appeared through the swirling snow like a mirage, its dark silhouette barely visible against the white chaos that had consumed the world around them. Harlan had spotted it on his GPS first, a small structure marked as seasonal shelter that represented the difference between survival and becoming a cautionary tale told around campfires. The journey to reach it had tested both his improvised sled design and Willa's capacity to endure being dragged through a blizzard like emergency cargo. The contraption had held together better than either of them had dared hope. though Willa emerged from the tarp cocoon looking like she'd been tumbled in a cosmic washing machine, snow clinging to every surface and her face pale with cold that had seeped through even their careful preparations. "Still alive back there?" Harlan asked, as he helped her extract herself from the sled's confines. "Define alive," Willa muttered, stamping her feet to restore circulation. Her left leg was cramping again, the cold and inactivity combining to trigger spasms that made her bite back groans of frustration. The cabin was smaller than either of them had hoped. A single room with a stone fireplace, a few pieces of rough furniture, and the musty smell of abandonment. But it had 4 walls and a roof that seemed sound, which made it a palace under the circumstances. More importantly, it had firewood stacked beside the hearth and what looked like emergency supplies stored in a wooden crate near the back wall. Harlan moved through the space with efficient purpose, checking the chimney drawer, testing the structural integrity of the furniture, inventorying their resources with the methodical attention of someone who understood that overlooked details. Killed people. Willa watched him work, impressed despite herself by his competence. "Fire first, then we'll see what we're working with," he said, already arranging kindling in the fireplace. "This place gets warm. It'll be comfortable enough. If not, we'll be sharing body heat before morning." The comment was practical rather than suggestive, but it reminded Willa of just how intimate their situation had become. Stranded together, dependent on each other, forced into a proximity that her carefully constructed solitude had been designed to avoid. The thought made her stomach flutter with something that might have been anxiety, or might have been something else entirely. The fire caught quickly, filling the small space with dancing light and the promise of warmth. Harlan fed it carefully, building heat without wasting fuel, displaying the kind of fire management skills that came from experience, rather than theory. Soon the cabin began to feel less like a trap and more like sanctuary. "Coffee?" Harlan asked, producing a large thermos from his emergency supplies. "Made it this morning, still hot." The simple question felt loaded with significance. Sharing coffee meant acknowledging that they were partners in this situation, rather than strangers thrown together by circumstance. It meant conversation, the kind of human connection that Willa had been avoiding for 3 years. But the warmth rising from the thermos when he opened it smelled like civilization, like mornings when the world made sense and problems could be solved with caffeine and determination. She found herself nodding before her defenses could object. Harlan poured the coffee into 2 metal cups, steam rising from the dark liquid like offerings to whatever gods watched over fools caught in blizzards. He handed her one, their fingers brushing briefly in the transfer, and Willa was surprised by the contact's warmth and roughness of his skin. "To surviving our own stupidity," he said, raising his cup in a mock toast. "Speak for yourself," Willa replied, but she clinked her cup against his anyway. "I was just collecting firewood. You're the one who decided to play Good Samaritan in a blizzard." The coffee was strong enough to strip paint and flavored with the kind of bitter honesty that came from beans chosen for effectiveness rather than gourmet appeal. It was perfect, exactly what the situation demanded, practical and warming and real in a way that cut through pretense. They drank in comfortable silence for a few minutes, the fire crackling between them and the storm howling. Outside, like something alive and angry. The cabin felt increasingly secure as it warmed, a pocket of safety carved from the hostile wilderness by human stubbornness and the simple miracle of controlled fire. "What were you doing out there anyway?" Willa asked finally. "I mean, really. Most people with vehicles like yours don't take the scenic route through blizzards." Harlan was quiet. For so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he did speak, his voice carried the weight of someone who'd been carrying a story alone for too long. Coming back from a cattle auction in Steamboat Springs. Could have taken the interstate. Probably should have. But sometimes the long way feels more honest. Honest about what? Another pause, longer this time. About the fact that I don't much like where I'm going. The admission hung in the air between them, more intimate than anything they'd shared despite the physical proximity their survival had demanded. Willa recognized the tone, the voice of someone who'd built a life that looked successful from the outside but felt empty from within. "Big house waiting for you?" she asked gently. "Big everything, house, ranch, bank accounts, all very impressive. On paper." Harlan stared into his coffee as if it might contain answers to questions he hadn't learned how to ask. "Turns out you can have everything you thought you wanted and still feel like you're living someone else's life." Willa understood that feeling better than she cared to admit. Her own life before the accident had been built around external validation. Championship, belt buckles, newspaper articles, the roar of crowds when she posted a winning time. All of it had evaporated the moment she hit the ground, revealing how little substance had been underneath the performance. "What about you?" Harlan asked. "What sends a woman to live alone in the mountains with nothing but horses for company?" The question was fair. He'd shared something real, and courtesy demanded reciprocation. But talking about the accident meant revisiting the moment when everything changed, the instant when her identity had been reduced to a medical diagnosis and a limitation that would define everything that came after. "Used to be a barrel racer," she said finally. "Pretty good one, actually. 3-time national champion, sponsors, the whole circuit." "Used to be," Harlan noted. "What happened?" "Horse spooked during practice. Went down hard, messed up my spine." "Pretty thoroughly. Doctors said I was lucky to walk again." She laughed, but there wasn't much humor in it. "Took me a while to figure out what luck looks like when everything you are gets taken away in 15 seconds. Harlan nodded slowly, understanding passing between them without need for elaboration. They'd both lost versions of themselves, traded who they'd been for who circumstances had forced them to become. "The horses I saw at your place," he said. "You still ride?" "No." The word came out sharper than she'd intended. "That part of my life is over. Seems like a waste. Good horses from what I could see, well cared for. They're companions, not tools. I'm not in the business of proving anything anymore." But even as she said it, Willa wondered if that was entirely true. Living alone in the mountains, handling everything herself despite her limitations. Wasn't that just another kind of performance? Another way of proving that she was still whole despite the evidence to the contrary? The storm continued to rage. Outside, but inside the small cabin, two people who'd spent years avoiding exactly this kind of conversation found themselves sharing more than warmth and coffee. They were sharing the weight of dreams deferred and identities lost, the particular loneliness that came from living lives that looked nothing like what they'd planned. And neither of them was quite ready to examine why that sharing felt less like burden and more like relief. Dawn brought no relief from the storm. If anything, the wind had grown more vicious overnight, howling around the cabin with a persistence that suggested the weather system had settled in for a long siege. Harlan woke first, his internal clock calibrated by decades of early ranch mornings, and spent several minutes listening to the wind before accepting that their refuge was temporary at best. The fire had burned down to coals during the night, but the cabin retained enough warmth to keep them comfortable. Willa slept curled on her side near the hearth, using her coat as a pillow and looking younger in sleep than her waking wariness. Aloud, her dark hair had escaped its ponytail during the night, framing her face in a way that made Harlan catch himself staring longer than was strictly appropriate. He rebuilt the fire quietly, not wanting to wake her yet. The storm would dictate their schedule now, and rest was a resource to be conserved like food or firewood. But as he coaxed flames from the coals, Willa stirred and opened her eyes, immediately alert in the way of people who'd learned that relaxation was a luxury not everyone could afford. "Still blowing," she observed, listening to the wind's assault. "On their shelter. Worse than yesterday, if anything." Harlan handed her a cup of coffee from the thermos he'd kept warm near the fire. "Radio says this system's stalled out over the mountains. Could be here for days." The news should have been alarming, but Willa found herself oddly calm about their extended imprisonment. The cabin was warm, their supplies adequate, and something about Harlan's steady competence made the situation feel manageable rather than desperate. It was the first time in years she'd felt genuinely safe, depending on someone else's judgment. "Guess we better get comfortable then," she said, accepting the coffee gratefully. But comfortable was a relative term when you were trapped in close quarters with a stranger who'd become less strange with every shared hour. The forced intimacy of their situation was creating a kind of accelerated acquaintance that normally took months to develop. They'd already seen each other at their most vulnerable, cold, frightened, dependent, and that shared experience was breaking down barriers faster than either of them was prepared to handle. "Tell me about your ranch," Willa said, partly to fill the silence, and partly because she was genuinely curious about the life Harlan was so reluctant to return to. 15,000 acres, mostly grazing land, run about 3,000 head of cattle, some horses. His voice carried the tone of someone reciting statistics rather than describing something he loved. "Been in my family for 3 generations, though I've expanded it considerably since taking over." "Sounds impressive. It's profitable." The distinction was subtle but telling. "My grandfather started with a few hundred acres and a dream of something bigger. My father doubled the size and made it sustainable. I turned it into a business. Empire, and that's bad because—" Harlan was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire as if it might contain answers to questions he'd been avoiding. "Because somewhere along the way, I forgot that the point wasn't to own the most land or run the most cattle. The point was to build something worth passing on." The weight of regret in his voice was unmistakable, and Willa found herself leaning forward, drawn into his story, despite her usual reluctance to get involved in other people's complications. What happened to change that? Another pause. Longer. This time, when Harlan spoke again, his voice was so quiet she had to strain to hear it over the wind. "I had a daughter, Sarah, beautiful, bright, stubborn as hell. Used to follow me around the ranch when she was little, asking questions about everything, making plans for when she'd be old enough to help for real." His hands tightened around his coffee cup. "But as the ranch grew bigger, I got busier, more time in the office, more time with lawyers and accountants and investment advisors. Less time for a little girl who just wanted her daddy to teach her how to rope calves." Willa felt her chest tighten with recognition. She'd seen enough families torn apart by ambition disguised as responsibility, enough parents who confused, providing with presence. "She grew up," Harlan continued, "grew away from me, really. By the time she was a teenager, I was a stranger living in the same house, a stranger who paid for everything but knew nothing about her life, her dreams, her struggles." The past tense wasn't lost on Willa, and she braced herself for the revelation she could feel coming. College helped some. She studied environmental science, had big plans for sustainable ranching, wanted to come back and revolutionize everything we were doing. "For a while, I thought maybe we'd get a second chance, you know? Maybe we could be partners instead of strangers. But I was still the same man who'd put business before family for 20 years, still measured success in dollars instead of relationships. When she graduated and came home with all her ideas about conservation and land management, I shot her down, told her the ranch was running fine without her environmental theories, that she needed to understand how the real world worked before she started trying to fix things that weren't broken." Willa could picture it too clearly. A young woman full of passion and education, running headlong into the wall of her father's established certainty. The collision would have been devastating for both of them. "She left again," Harlan said simply. "Moved to California, got a job with the Park Service. We talked maybe twice a year after that, awkward phone calls on holidays where we both pretended everything was fine." The story was heading somewhere dark, and Willa found herself wishing she could stop it, redirect the conversation back to safer ground. But Harlan needed to tell it, and she owed him the courtesy of listening. 2 years ago, I got a call from the police in Sacramento. She'd taken her own life. Left a note saying she was tired of feeling like a disappointment. Tired. of never being good enough for the people who were supposed to love her unconditionally. The words hit Willa like physical blows. She'd lost her career, her identity, her place in the world, but she'd never lost hope entirely. The idea of someone choosing to surrender that completely, especially someone young enough to rebuild whatever had been broken, was almost incomprehensible. "I'm sorry," she said, the words inadequate but necessary. I can't imagine. The worst part is, she wasn't a disappointment. She was everything I should have been proud of, smart, passionate, committed to making the world better. But I was too busy building an empire to notice I was raising a daughter who would have been a better steward of the land than I ever was. They sat in silence for several minutes, the only sounds the crackling fire and the wind's continued assault on their shelter. Finally, Willa reached into her coat pocket and pulled out something she'd been carrying for 3 years, but had never shown to another person. The championship belt buckle was tarnished now, its silver surface dulled by time, and the oils from her fingers during the countless hours she'd held it like a talisman. But the engraving was still clear. National Barrel, Racing Champion, along with the year that had marked the peak of everything she'd thought she wanted to be. "I've been carrying this around like some kind of proof," she said quietly, holding the buckle so Harlan could see it. "Proof that I used to be somebody important, somebody who mattered. But listening to you talk about Sarah, maybe holding onto who we used to be isn't the same thing as honoring what we've learned." Harlan studied the buckle, then looked at her face with new understanding. "That's quite an accomplishment. 3-time champion is nothing to dismiss lightly." "No, but it's not everything either. I thought it was, for a long time. Thought that without the racing, without the recognition, I was nothing. But maybe the real accomplishment is figuring out how to live a good life after everything you planned gets taken away." "And have you figured it out, I mean?" Willa considered the question honestly. "I thought I had. Thought isolation was the same thing as independence, that not needing anyone was the same thing as being strong. But sitting here with you, depending on your help to survive, it doesn't feel as terrible as I expected it to." The admission surprised her with its honesty. Even more surprising was the way Harlan smiled in response, the first genuine expression of happiness she'd seen from him since they'd met. "Maybe that's what we're both learning out here," he said, "that the people we used to be don't have to define the people we choose to become." Outside, the storm continued its relentless assault, but inside the small cabin, 2 people who'd been carrying their losses alone began to understand that sharing the weight might not make them weaker after all. By the 3rd morning, the storm had finally begun to show signs of weakening. The wind still howled, but with less conviction than before, and occasional breaks in the snow allowed glimpses of the grey sky beyond. Harlan was checking their supplies when his wallet slipped from his jacket pocket, spilling its contents across the cabin's rough wooden floor. Willa moved to help gather the scattered cards and bills, but froze when her fingers closed around a photograph that had fallen face up near the fire. The image showed a young woman in graduation regalia, cap tilted at a jaunty angle, arms raised. In triumph, she was beautiful in the way that youth made everyone beautiful, but there was something else there, too. An intelligence in her eyes, a determination in her stance that spoke of someone ready to take on the world. What made Willa's blood run cold was the newspaper clipping tucked behind the photograph. She could only see part of the headline, but the words "environmental activist" and "suicide" were clearly visible, along with what looked like a date from 2 years ago. "Sarah?" she asked quietly, holding up the photograph. Harlan's face went white. He reached for the picture, but Willa didn't release it immediately. Something about his expression, guilt mixed with panic, made her look more carefully at the newspaper clipping. "Harlan," she said slowly, "what exactly happened to your daughter?" The silence stretched between them like a chasm. Outside, the wind had dropped to almost nothing, making the quiet inside the cabin feel heavy and dangerous. Harlan sat down heavily on one of the rough benches, his hands shaking slightly as he ran them through his grey hair. "Give me the clipping." he said finally. "I think I'd rather read it myself." Willa's voice was steady, but her heart was racing. Something was very wrong here, something that went beyond the story he'd told her about a distant father and a disappointed daughter. With careful fingers, she extracted the newspaper clipping from behind the photograph. The headline made her stomach lurch. "Environmental activist takes own life after father's ranch wins federal grazing rights case." The article was brief, but devastating. Sarah Creed, 24, had been found dead in her Sacramento apartment 2 days after her father's ranch had successfully fought off environmental challenges to its federal grazing permits. Friends said she'd been devastated by the legal victory, which she saw as a personal betrayal of everything she'd worked for in environmental conservation. She wasn't just studying environmental science, Willa said, her voice barely above a whisper. She was actively fighting against what you were doing. Harlan's head was in his hands now, his shoulders shaking with suppressed emotion. "It's more complicated than that, is it?" Willa read further, her anger building with each paragraph. "According to this, she'd spent 2 years organizing opposition to your ranch's grazing practices. She'd filed formal complaints with the forest Service, testified at hearings, rallied other environmental groups to challenge your permits. Willa, please. And you knew. You had to have known. This says she identified herself as your daughter in her testimony, used her family connection to add credibility to her environmental concerns." Willa looked up from the clipping, her eyes blazing. "She wasn't trying to come home and help you modernize the ranch. She was trying to stop you from destroying public land." The truth hung between them like smoke, acrid and choking. Everything Harlan had told her about his relationship with Sarah had been carefully edited, a version of events that cast him as a neglectful father, rather than what he really was, a man whose business practices had driven his daughter to such despair that she'd chosen death over watching him win. "The night before the final hearing," Harlan said quietly, not looking at her, "she called me. First time we'd talked in 6 months. She begged me to withdraw the application, said it would mean everything to her if I'd just consider changing how we managed the land. And I told her business was business, that I couldn't let environmental extremists dictate how I ran a ranch that had been in our family for 3 generations. I told her she was naive if she thought I'd sacrifice my livelihood for her. College idealism." Willa felt sick. The story he'd told her about a father too busy to pay attention to his daughter was bad enough, but this was something far worse. This was about a man who'd actively chosen profit over his child's deepest convictions, who'd used his wealth and influence to crush the very cause she'd dedicated her life to supporting. "She killed herself 2 days later," Harlan continued, his voice hollow. "Left a note saying she couldn't live in a world where the people who were supposed to love her would rather destroy the earth than admit they might be wrong." Jesus! Willa stared at the photograph of Sarah's triumphant graduation smile, trying to reconcile that joy with the despair that must have followed. "And you've been carrying this around for 2 years? Every day? That picture, that article, the note she left, reminders of what my stubbornness cost." The revelation recontextualized everything about their time together. Harlan's rescue of her hadn't been simple Good Samaritan behavior. It had been the desperate act of a man trying to save someone, anyone, after failing to save the person who mattered most. His tenderness toward her, his careful attention to her needs, his refusal to give up even when the situation seemed hopeless, all of it had been colored by his guilt over Sarah. "Is that what this is about?" Willa asked, her voice sharp with betrayal. "Saving the crippled woman to make up for letting your daughter die? Some kind of cosmic do-over?" "No." Harlan's response was immediate and fierce. "It's not like that." "Then what is it like?" "Because right now it feels like I've been participating in your therapy session without knowing it." Harlan finally looked at her, and she was shocked by the pain in his eyes. "At first, maybe. When I saw you in the snow, when you wouldn't ask. For help even though you were clearly in trouble. Yes, it reminded me of her, of how she fought alone because she couldn't trust that I'd support her. But the more time I've spent with you, the more I've realized this isn't about Sarah at all. It's about you and who you are, and the fact that you're worth saving for your own sake, not as some kind of memorial to my failures as a father. Willa wanted to believe him, but the betrayal cut deep. She'd shared her own story, her own vulnerabilities, thinking they were connecting as equals. Instead, she'd been unknowingly playing a role in his personal redemption narrative. "The grazing permits," she said suddenly. "Do you still have them?" Harlan was quiet for a long moment. "Yes. And are you still running cattle on that land?" "The way Sarah objected to." Another pause. "Yes. So nothing's actually changed. You're still the man who valued profit over his daughter's life, still doing the same things that drove her to despair. The only difference is now you rescue strangers in blizzards to feel better about it." The accusation hung in the air like an indictment. Harlan didn't deny it because he couldn't. It was essentially true. He'd continued his practices, maintained his permits, run his ranch exactly as he had before Sarah's death. The only thing that had changed was his guilt level and his desperate need to prove he wasn't the monster his daughter had believed him to be. "Willa," he started, but she cut him off. "No, don't. Don't try to explain or justify or make it sound better than it is." She stood up, testing her leg's strength. The cramping had improved over the past few days, and while she wasn't ready for any marathons, she could walk. "The storm's breaking. I can make it back to my cabin from here. You can't travel alone in these conditions. It's still dangerous out there. More dangerous than staying here with someone who's been lying to me for 3 days." The words hit Harlan like physical blows, but he didn't argue with their accuracy. He had been lying, or at least telling carefully edited versions of the truth. And now the weight of that deception was destroying whatever trust they'd built during their forced isolation. "Let me take you home," he said quietly. "After that, if you never want to see me again, I'll understand. But let me make sure you get there safely." Willa studied his face, looking for signs of manipulation or self-serving motivation, but all she saw was exhaustion and regret and the kind of bone-deep weariness that came from carrying guilt too. Heavy to bear alone. "Fine," she said finally, "but after you drop me off, we're done. Whatever this was, whatever I thought it might become, it's over." Harlan nodded, accepting the judgment he knew he deserved. As they prepared to leave the cabin that had sheltered them through the worst of the storm, both of them understood that some distances couldn't be measured in miles, and some forms of rescue came at too high a price to be called salvation. The journey back toward Willa's cabin began in bitter silence. The storm had indeed weakened, leaving behind a world transformed by 3 days of relentless snow. Drifts rose 8 and 10 feet high, sculpted by wind into fantastic shapes that made familiar landmarks unrecognizable. The tree that had blocked. The road was completely buried, creating a hill where none had existed before. Harlan navigated the snowcat with mechanical precision, checking GPS coordinates and calculating routes while studiously avoiding conversation. The revelation about Sarah had poisoned the fragile intimacy they'd built during their confinement, leaving them feeling more like strangers than they had when they'd first met. Worse than strangers, like people who'd trusted each other and been betrayed for their openness. Willa sat rigid in the passenger seat, arms crossed, staring out at the transformed landscape without really seeing it. The pain in her left leg had returned with vengeance during their preparation to leave the cabin. The combination of cold and stress triggering spasms that made her bite her lip to keep from crying out. But she'd be damned if she'd show weakness. To a man who'd been treating her like a charity case from the beginning. What made it worse was that part of her understood his motivation. Guilt was a powerful force, capable of driving people to extraordinary acts of attempted redemption. She'd seen it in the rodeo world, competitors who'd been injured or made mistakes developing almost manic dedication to helping others avoid their fate. but understanding didn't make the deception hurt any less. They'd been traveling for maybe 20 minutes when Harlan finally broke the silence. "I need to stop and check the route ahead. GPS is showing some inconsistencies that could mean impassable terrain." He pulled the snowcat to a halt near what had once been a scenic overlook, but now looked like the surface of an alien planet. The familiar valley was gone, replaced by an endless expanse of white, broken only by the dark spears of buried fence posts and the occasional crown of a pine tree. "Jesus," Willa breathed despite herself. "I've never seen it this deep." "Storm's been stalled for 3 days, probably dropped 6 feet of new snow, plus whatever drifting the wind caused." Harlan was studying his instruments, but his expression was troubled. "Your cabin's down in that valley. If the snow's this deep up here," he didn't need to finish the thought. Willa's cabin sat in a natural depression that would have collected every flake that fell, plus everything the wind had stripped from the surrounding ridges. It could be buried completely, or at least buried deeply enough to make reaching it impossible without specialized equipment. "The horses," Willa said suddenly, the reality of the situation hitting her. "Thunder, sage, and dusty. They're in the barn, but if the snow's that deep, they could be trapped without food or water. Horses are resourceful. They'll have found ways to manage. For 3 days, maybe. But if we can't get to them..." She couldn't finish the thought. Those horses were the only living connections she had to her former life, the only relationships that hadn't been complicated by pity or guilt or the weight of what she used to be. Harlan was quiet for a moment, studying the terrain ahead. When he spoke, his voice was carefully neutral. "There might be another way in. Old mining road that comes down the backside of your property. Steeper grade, but it might have less snow accumulation because of the wind patterns." "How do you know about the mining road?" "I've been buying land in this area for years, done my research on access routes, water rights, that sort of thing." He paused. "Your property was actually on my list of potential acquisitions before I found out it had been sold." The information hit Willa like a slap. "You were planning to buy my home. It was just business. Good grazing land, water access, strategic location for connecting some of my other holdings." "Business," she laughed bitterly. "Everything's just business with you, isn't it? Land, permits, even rescue operations. That's not fair." "Isn't it? You're the man who chose business over his daughter's life. Why should I be any different?" The accusation hung between them like a challenge. Harlan's hands tightened on the steering wheel, but he didn't respond immediately. Instead, he put the snowcat back in gear and began navigating toward the mining road he'd mentioned. The route was treacherous, following a narrow track that had been carved into the mountainside decades earlier by men chasing veins of silver that mostly existed in their imaginations. The snow was lighter here, as Harlan had predicted, but the grade was steep enough to make the snowcat's engine work hard, and the drop-off on one side was spectacular and terrifying. It was during this careful navigation that Willa felt the familiar tightness in her chest that had become her enemy over the past 3 years. At first, she thought it was just anxiety about the dangerous road, but as the sensation persisted and began to spread down her left arm, she realized with cold clarity that this was something much worse. The medical alert bracelet on her wrist felt suddenly heavy, weighted with information she'd never shared with anyone, not even the few doctors she'd consulted since moving to the mountains. The rodeo accident had damaged more than her spine. It had created complications that made her isolated lifestyle not just a choice, but a necessity. "Harlan," she said quietly, "I need you to stop the vehicle." Something in her tone made him look at her sharply. Her face had gone pale, and she was breathing in the shallow, careful way of someone trying to manage pain or panic. "What's wrong? Just stop, please." He brought the snowcat to a halt on a relatively stable section of the road, but the engine idling couldn't mask the sound of Willa's increasingly labored breathing. "Willa, talk to me. What's happening?" She closed her eyes, trying to center herself through techniques she'd learned during her rehabilitation. But the tightness in her chest was getting worse, and she could feel her heart beginning to race. in the irregular pattern that had become terrifyingly familiar. "I need to tell you something," she said, her voice strained. "Something I should have mentioned before." Harlan was already reaching for his emergency supplies, pulling out a first aid kit and water. "Are you having a heart attack?" "Not exactly." Willa fumbled with the clasp of her medical alert bracelet, finally managing to remove it and hand it to him. "Read the back." The engraving was small but clear. "Cardiac arrhythmia, blood thinners, emergency contact," followed by a phone number. Harlan didn't recognize. "The accident didn't just damage my spine," Willa explained, each word carefully measured. "Trauma to my chest caused some heart damage too. Irregular rhythms, episodes of rapid heartbeat, usually manageable with medication, but stress and extreme cold can trigger episodes." "Episodes of what?" "Heart failure." The words were spoken, simply without drama, but they hit Harlan like physical blows. "I've been managing it for 3 years, avoiding situations that might trigger problems. It's why I live alone, why I don't travel, why I've been so careful about my limitations." "Jesus Christ, Willa. Why didn't you tell me this earlier?" "Because I knew you'd treat me differently, like I was made of glass, like every decision had to be filtered through my medical condition." Her breathing was becoming more difficult, but her voice remained steady. "I wanted to be Willa the person, not Willa the patient." Harlan stared at the bracelet in his hands, understanding flooding through him like ice water. Every moment of their journey had been potentially dangerous for her. The cold, the stress, the physical exertion, all of it could have triggered exactly what was happening now. "What do you need? What can I do?" "My medication is in my cabin." Without it, she didn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. They both understood what she was saying. "How long do we have?" "Hard to say. These episodes can last minutes or hours, but the longer it goes on, the more dangerous it becomes." Harlan looked ahead at the treacherous road, then back at Willa's increasingly pale face. They were still miles from her cabin, and even if they reached it, there was no guarantee they could get inside through the accumulated snow. But without her medication, they might not have hours to work with. "The ranger station where we were headed originally," he said. "It's closer, maybe has emergency supplies or communication equipment. Too far in the other direction. By the time we backtrack," she shook her head, "it has to be the cabin, even if we can't get inside." "Then we can't." Her voice was matter-of-fact, but her eyes were frightened. "But those horses need help regardless, and if something happens to me, at least I'll be home." The simple statement broke something inside Harlan's chest. Here was a woman facing potential death with the same stubborn courage she'd shown throughout. Their ordeal, more concerned about her animals than her own survival. It was exactly the kind of selfless strength his daughter had possessed, the kind of integrity he'd spent his life trying to buy instead of earn. "Nothing's going to happen to you," he said fiercely. "I'm getting you to that cabin. Getting you your medication, and making sure you're okay. After that, you can hate me all you want for lying to you, but you're not dying on my watch." Willa managed a weak smile. "Your watch, huh? When did I become your responsibility?" "The moment I decided to stop instead of driving past," Harlan replied, putting the snowcat back in gear. "Maybe earlier than that." As they resumed their dangerous journey down the mining road, both of them understood that the stakes had changed completely. This was no longer about trust or deception or the complicated weight of their respective pasts. This was about life and death, measured in heartbeats and the distance to a small cabin that might or might not be accessible through 8 feet of snow. And somewhere in that race against time, Harlan Creed began to understand that saving Willa Brooks had become about something much more important than his own redemption. She stood on the porch of her cabin, 3 months after the storm that had changed everything, watching Harlan work with thunder in the small paddock he'd helped her build. The old gelding moved slowly but willingly under saddle, carrying Harlan's weight with the patience of a horse who understood that some riders needed extra time to find their confidence. It wasn't barrel racing, wasn't the kind of athletic partnership Willa had once taken for granted, but it was connection, and connection had become precious in ways she was still learning to appreciate. Her recovery had been longer and more complicated than anyone had predicted. The cardiac episode during the storm had revealed damage that required surgery, followed by weeks of rehabilitation that taught her new limitations alongside new possibilities. The doctors had been cautiously optimistic, using phrases like manageable condition and lifestyle modifications that meant she would never again take her health for granted, but also meant she could plan for a future that extended beyond simple survival. Harlan had been there through all of it, not as a guilty rescuer seeking redemption, but as someone who understood that recovery was as much about learning to accept help as it was about getting stronger. He'd respected her need for independence while refusing to let her face the difficult days alone. It was a delicate balance that had taken time to achieve, but had proven more valuable than any medication the doctors prescribed. "He's looking good," Willa called out as Harlan guided Thunder through a series of gentle turns. "Feeling good too," Harlan replied, patting the gelding's neck. "Amazing what regular work can do for an old horse's attitude." The observation could have applied to either of them. Harlan had changed in the months since the storm, developing a gentleness that success and ambition had buried for too many years. He still ran his ranch, still made business decisions that affected thousands of acres and hundreds of employees, but he made them differently now, with consideration for consequences that extended beyond profit margins. The federal grazing permits that had driven Sarah to despair were among the first changes he'd implemented. Working with environmental groups, some of the same organizations his daughter had supported, he'd voluntarily reduced his cattle numbers and modified his practices to protect watershed areas and wildlife habitat. It hadn't been easy and it hadn't been cheap, but it had been necessary in ways that had nothing to do with business and everything to do with honoring a legacy he'd nearly destroyed through neglect. "There's something I want to show you," Harlan said as he dismounted and began untacking Thunder. "Something I've been working on." Willa raised an eyebrow. Over the past months, Harlan's projects had ranged from practical improvements to her property to grand gestures that embarrassed her with their thoughtfulness. The solar panel upgrade had been welcome. The fully stocked medical station had been necessary. The heated barn that could shelter her horses through any future storms had been life-changing, but she'd learned to be cautious about his surprises, which tended toward the overwhelming. "Please tell me you didn't buy me another piece of heavy equipment," she said. "Nothing like that, just a proposal of sorts." The word made her pulse quicken, though not in the dangerous way that had marked her cardiac episodes. This was different, the flutter of anticipation rather than medical crisis, though the distinction had taken time to learn. Harlan led her to his truck, where a small wrapped package sat on the dashboard. "Before you open it," he said, "I need you to understand what it represents." "Harlan, just listen, please." He took her hands in his, calloused palms that had grown familiar over the months of shared work and quiet evenings. "I've spent most of my life measuring success by how much I could accumulate, how much land I could own, how many zeros I could add to my net worth. But these past months with you have taught me that the only wealth that matters is what you build with someone else." Willa felt her throat tighten with emotion. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that I love you, not because you remind me of Sarah, not because saving you makes me feel better about my failures, but because you're stubborn and brave and honest in ways that make me want to be better than I've ever been." He handed her the package. "Open it." Inside the wrapping was a simple brass key, old and worn, attached to a keychain made from braided leather. Accompanying it was a hand-drawn map showing a small structure located on what appeared to be Harlan's property, nestled in a valley that bordered the national forest. "There's a cabin on the back section of my ranch," Harlan explained. "Built it years ago as a hunting lodge, but I haven't used it in decades. It's got solar power, a good well, enough land around it for horses and privacy." He paused, searching. for the right words. I'm not asking you to give up your independence. I'm asking if you'd consider sharing it." Willa stared at the key, understanding the magnitude of what he was offering. Not just a place to live, but a partnership that honored both their needs for solitude and their growing need for each other. "The cabin where I live now would always be yours. A retreat when you need time alone, a reminder of how strong you are when you choose to be." Harlan's voice was steady, but she could see the vulnerability in his eyes. "This isn't about me taking care of you or you fixing my guilt. This is about two people who've learned to trust each other, building something together." Willa turned the key over in her palm, feeling its weight and history. Eugene's cabin had taught her that she could survive alone, that broken didn't mean helpless. But the storm had taught her something else, that survival was different from living, and that the courage to depend on someone else was its own kind of strength. "The horses would have their own pasture?" she asked. 20 acres of the best grazing land in the county. "And you wouldn't try to fix everything that I'm perfectly capable of handling myself?" "I would try very hard to remember that you managed 3 years alone before I showed up. And if I need space, need time to myself, then you take it. No questions, no guilt, no making it about my insecurities." Willa looked up at Harlan's face, seeing the man who'd carried her through a blizzard, who'd stayed beside her hospital bed, who'd learned to gentle old horses and his own ambitions with equal patience. The storm had brought them together, but everything since had been choice, the daily decision to trust, to risk, to build something fragile and valuable from the wreckage of their separate solitudes. "When would you want an answer?" "There's no timeline. The key is yours regardless. The cabin, the land, the offer, they'll be there when you're ready, if you're ever ready." The generosity of it, the complete absence of pressure or manipulation, made her decision easier than she'd expected. Some risks were worth taking, especially when they were offered by someone who'd proven their worth through actions rather than words. "I have one condition," she said finally. "Name it. We install a weather radio in the new cabin. A good one. Because if we're going to build a life together, I want to make damn sure we can see the storms coming." Harlan's smile was worth every moment of fear she'd overcome to reach this point. "Deal," he said, and kissed her with the tenderness of someone who understood that some rescues took months to complete, and that the best ones saved everyone involved. Outside, the spring snow was beginning to melt, feeding streams that would carry the winter's accumulation down to valleys where new things could grow. And in the warmth of trust, finally earned and freely given, two people who'd learned to survive alone discovered that living together might be the greatest adventure of all.